All right, so thank you both and have a great presentation, and I will be here if you need anything, so you can just write me in the chat. All right, so I'm gonna hit broadcast, and Margaret, I would just suggest waiting a beat just for people to come in. So here we go. Thanks for being here.
Yep. Okay. Let me dump the dog outside. Sorry, my dog started to bark at exactly that moment. Well, hello, as people are joining us, we're going to wait a minute and let people come on board. But welcome. I'm going to try to make my dog stop. All right. Well, hi again. Sorry that my dog started to bark as soon as it was time to get going. I see that we only have a couple of guests so far, but it's 7:04, so I figure we can at least start with presenting ourselves and welcoming people who are joining us. I'm Margaret Watt. I'm the Prevention Director at Positive Directions, the Center for Prevention and Counseling, which is a nonprofit behavioral health organization located in Westport. We provide mental health and substance use prevention, treatment, and recovery. And in this guise, I'm here because we also are the fiduciaries and co-coordinators of the Westport Prevention Coalition. That is a group of anyone in Westport, any interested stakeholder looking to prevent substance misuse across the lifespan. My co-chair is Kevin Godburn from Westport Youth Services, who will be with us shortly. And so tonight we have the pleasure of introducing Nicole Wachowski from Mothers Against Drunk Driving with their excellent presentation, The Power of Parents. Nicole.
Hi, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. I know that it's a difficult time of year to be able to kind of get together. I know with kind of the weather getting nicer and with all the school activities coming to an end right now and spring sports and all that happening, it's difficult to be able to get parents together. But at the same time, this is why it's really important to get parents together, because as things start opening up more, as those spring activities start, and as we get into that prom and graduation season, this is where it really opens up our teens more to being susceptible to the dangers of alcohol and marijuana. So we appreciate you having you here tonight, and hope that you can learn a little bit more about the dangers and why it's important to talk to your teens. And then take that information back to have those discussions with your teens. So I'm going to just change over to sharing my screen so we can start the presentation. Okay. Okay. So at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, we have 4 parts to our mission. So a lot of times when people hear our name, they think of just the drunk driving piece of it, which obviously is a very important piece. But that's really just one part of what we do. So obviously in our effort to end drunk driving, we do a lot of education regarding drunk driving. When it comes to adults, we have education programs for people who've had a DUI already. We also have just general programs out in the community, and we have our programs in the schools, which are more geared towards underage drinking as a whole, not just drinking and driving. A lot of our work to end drunk driving also is to work with law enforcement to make sure that laws are being enforced regarding drunk driving, because we know that if people think the laws will be enforced, they're less likely to break those laws. And then we also have been working with technology to end drunk driving. And this is actually something that's really been at the forefront this year as part of the infrastructure bill this year. A piece was passed that all new cars, starting just a few years from now, will have technology in them, at the very least to sense drunk driving, but it, depending on what device is picked, it may sense all types of impairment. And that's going to be in all new cars. So it will take a long time for that to kind of filter through to all of society. But hopefully by the time that our kids are older and they're talking to their kids, they won't even have to talk about drunk driving anymore. That won't even be a thing. So that's just some really cool stuff that's on the forefront. Our efforts also, we do a lot to help fight drugged driving. We know that that's very common these days as well, especially now with marijuana becoming legal in Connecticut. Also just with medical marijuana having been around, and with the opioid epidemic, with prescription drug use, all of that. Sometimes people just don't feel like the drug that they're using causes impairment, especially if it's something that's prescribed to them. So we do a lot of work on educating people about drugged driving. Underage drinking prevention is a key piece of what we do, especially in our youth department, which is what I am the program manager for. And we really want to prevent underage drinking as a whole for two reasons. One, we know that the earlier someone starts drinking, the more likely they are to develop problem use later in life, and the more likely they are to drink and drive as adults. So we are certainly trying to prevent that drunk driving as adults by preventing underage drinking. But we also know that every year over 4,300 teens die from underage drinking, and only a third of those are related to cars. We'll talk a little bit more later on about what those other areas are, but we want to prevent that underage drinking as a whole to capture that other 2/3. If we just talked about drunk driving, we're only capturing 1/3 of those deaths. And then the fourth part of our mission is to support our victims. A victim can be somebody who's been impacted by drunk driving themselves if they've been injured. It could be that they've had a family member who's been injured or killed, or a friend. And our victim services team is always available free of charge whenever needed to support them. It could be 5 years after the crash. It could be 20 years after the crash. They go to court with victims. They just are there to talk to victims on difficult days, support them through the process, whatever they might need. So if anyone ever should come across a victim at some point or become a victim and need support, please reach out to us. So in our youth department, we have two main programs. The program you're seeing tonight is our Power of Parents program, which is geared towards parents and community members on talking about the dangers of underage drinking and marijuana use. And then we have our Power of Youth program, which is very similar. A lot of the same information is presented, but it's presented to youth in schools and community centers. Again, focusing on some of those dangers, and also getting teens to kind of think about long-term consequences and where they want to be down the road, and kind of are the choices that they're making today getting them there or not. So if you are involved in a school or a community center, or really anywhere where youth meet, and you'd like us to present one of those programs, those are free of charge as well. You can always reach out to us and we can come out and do one of those programs, or do one virtually as well. And Nationwide is our sponsor for our Power of Parents program. We're just going to have a quick message from Martha Fry from Nationwide.
Nicole, we can't hear her.
Okay, sometimes when there's a video within a video, it doesn't play, so I'm just going to skip that one then. But Martha was just pretty much welcoming everyone and just explaining the Power of Youth and Power of Parents program. So that's okay to skip. So tonight our program is going to have 5 main objectives. First, we're going to talk about the problems and consequences of underage drinking and marijuana use. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what the role of teens, friends, and peers are, what the role of adults in general is, and then parents specifically. And then we'll wrap up with talking about what you can do today and tomorrow and in the future to keep your children safe. A key point of our program, when we call it the Power of Parents, we really mean that. We want you to remember that you do have the power to make the difference, and that what you say to your kids is important, and they are listening. So as you hear the information tonight, we want you to feel empowered to be able to take that back to your kids and have those conversations. Okay, so a little bit about the problems and consequences. So alcohol is the #1 drug of choice for youth. So sometimes parents will think, well, it's not as big of a deal. I need to talk to my kids about some of the harder drugs and things like that. But it's the drug that they're most commonly using, and it's probably going to be the first one that they experience. So it's really important for us to talk to our kids about alcohol and not just think we only have to talk to them about the things that seem a little bit more serious. Teen alcohol use, like I said before, kills more than 4,300 youth each year. And kids who start drinking young are 7 times more likely to be in an alcohol-related crash at some point in their life. If you're wondering when to start talking to your kids about underage drinking and alcohol use, kids actually start weighing the pros and cons of drinking alcohol around age 8. This is when they start to think and have their thoughts of like, ooh, that's yucky, or I wouldn't do that, or, it's not safe to drink and drive. They start to have those thoughts. Or if they hear opposite things from their parents, they might start to have positive thoughts regarding it. So it's never too early to start, and especially having those conversations in elementary school, just very basic conversations, and then moving those conversations gradually to be a little bit more advanced as they get a little older. So some people will think, especially parents who have teenagers will think, well, okay, I want my kids in my home having the party. I don't want them going out, but as long as they're in the house and we take away the keys, we've taken away all the risk. So let's just have everybody come over. Their parents can drop them off, or they can take an Uber here and everybody will be fine. Like I said before, the underage drinking related deaths related to cars are only about 1/3. The other 2/3 come from things like homicide, suicide, other poisonings, alcohol poisoning, drownings, fires, falls, and then kind of anything else that you could capture in that 1% of other category. So really, if you think that, you're really only taking away that 1/3 risk, right? There are so many other things that could happen in the home related to underage drinking. And this just accounts for the deaths. This doesn't account for all of the injuries that happen every year, all of the kids that are sent to the ER for injuries, for alcohol poisoning, for things like that as well. So it really is a myth to think that our kids are going to be safe as long as I have them here in my home and I'm able to kind of control the situation. Just to talk a little bit about some local statistics here in Connecticut. So COVID has kind of given us a little bit of a lag on getting our statistics, but our most recent that we have are from 2017-18. So nationally, about 19.3% of 12 to 20-year-olds had consumed alcohol in the month leading up to the survey. And here in Connecticut, that number was higher, it's 26.2%. So while that number has decreased over the past 10 to 15 years, it is still a high number, and we do still want to focus on this and remind our children about the dangers. The positive side of this is that when you ask teens how many people they think are drinking, they tend to say 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10, things like that. So they think that number is a lot higher than it really is. So it's really important to educate them on how really low that number is. On the flip side, it's important to educate parents on that the number still is 26%, because parents tend to think that number might be even lower than 26%. So it's important on both ends to have a realistic idea of what that number might be. There was a study that we did where we asked parents if their children binge drink, and 1 out of 100 parents thought their kids were binge drinking, where that number is really closer to 1 out of 7. So there really is a disconnect between what the stats are telling us and what both teens and parents may think.
Nicole,
so according to the oh yes, go ahead.
I was just going to interject for a moment that if anyone wants to see some data at the end of this presentation, we did conduct a youth survey last year in Westport, but I can just say, just by comparison, in Westport during COVID, when you would think alcohol would be a little bit less easy to access for teens and there were fewer parties happening, we did find that, like Nicole said, the majority of kids were not drinking or using other drugs. 3/4 were not. But among our middle school and high school students in Westport, 25% were drinking at the time. This was last spring. And if you looked at and it was, 9% of middle schoolers, 33% of high schoolers. And if you looked at just seniors, like high school seniors in their last year, 60% of them were drinking. So that's just to say that the Westport data is a little different from the national. Still, the majority aren't drinking, but with each year that they get older, there's a little bit of an increased likelihood, and it is really something to be concerned about in Westport. It's a little higher than the state average.
Definitely. And there was a national study, I don't think it was in Connecticut, about the kids who were drinking during COVID, even though there weren't really a huge increase in who was drinking, the amount that they were drinking was increasing. So that's especially alarming for those specific kids that maybe they weren't binge drinking before and now they are, and maybe they're just doing it in their home by themselves. They're not even doing it to be social, and it became more of a habit for them. So another study in Connecticut found that 70% of 8th graders say that alcohol is very easy or fairly easy to obtain. And generally, when asked where they can obtain alcohol, it usually is that they're saying that they're finding it in their own home or their friends' homes from their parents. The 2019 Connecticut High School Youth Risk Behavior Survey reported that 11.7% of high school students had consumed alcohol more than just a few sips before the age of 13, and that 12.9% of students had said that they binge drank in the last 30 days. So that is having 4 or more drinks for females and 5 or more drinks for males, kind of in one sitting or in like a 2-hour period, or kind of in the length that they're at a party. Okay. So really one of the most important things when we talk about underage drinking and its effects is that the human brain is really not developed until your mid-20s. And this is actually something that a lot of teens are aware of now that we weren't really aware of before, and they actually do know this information. And that's helpful because we can talk about that their brains aren't fully developed yet. And this is really why that reason of 21 is in place, that it's not just an arbitrary number. So this is a depiction of a brain from the 5-year-old brain to the 20-year-old brain. And the more purple it is, the more developed it is. So the last part of the brain to develop is that little square that you see on the right-hand corner. And that has to do with our executive functions. So things like logic, reasoning, decision-making skills, all of that is housed in those executive functions. And it's not fully developed until your mid-20s. And so think about a teen who doesn't really have that part of their brain developed fully to begin with. And then they're adding in a substance that impairs all of us, even as adults. They're definitely going to make poor decisions, right? Because they don't make those good decisions to begin with. And now they've added some kind of impairing drug to it. So not only can it have them make bad decisions in the short term, like, just in that moment because they're impaired, it also can hinder the development of that brain from developing the way it should be. And like we mentioned before, the earlier someone starts drinking, the more likely they're to become addicted as adults, because when our brains are still developing, they're more susceptible to addiction. So the earlier someone starts, the more likely it is to develop that they are to develop problem use later in life. So this definitely can be a long-term problem as well. So let's talk a little bit about the role that your teen's friends and peers have. So like I mentioned before, middle schoolers and high schoolers tend to overestimate how many teens are drinking alcohol and how much alcohol is being consumed. So whether they just think that it's happening, or maybe some of their friends are drinking, so it feels like their whole world, everyone is drinking, or people are maybe even exaggerating what they're having, all of that leads to this feeling like everyone is drinking and I need to drink to fit in. So it's really important to remember to tell our teens that that's not really what's going on, so they have a realistic understanding of what is happening. So teens may know the potential risks of drinking and using marijuana, but they might think, well, my friends have done it and nothing bad has ever happened to them. And that may also lead to this kind of idea that it's safe to do because I've never really heard of anybody that's gotten too sick from it, or that's had some kind of accident or anything occur from it. So that perception of harm may be low. So what is the role of other adults? So not parents, but just kind of the community as a whole. So some misperceptions of adults are that if they let their teen drink in the home, it takes away the mystery and it takes away their desire to drink outside of the home. They think that they drank when they were a teenager and they turned out okay, so their teen will be the same, when really we don't have an indicator of who's going to become addicted or not. So just to say I was okay, my kids are going to be okay as well, is not a fair statement. And they may feel like it's a special occasion, so it's fine to do on those days. Parents or other adults may also feel like, in Europe, they don't have drinking problems and their drinking ages are much lower. They might be 18 or even lower than that. And it's actually not true. This graph here shows the percentage of teens or those under 21 that binge drink. So if you see here in the United States, it's about 19%. Almost every other country in Europe has a higher drinking rate than us for binge drinking. There are a few that are lower, but most are higher. One of the ones that you see here that's lower is Italy. And I think that's probably the one that people put in their heads that, they just kind of associate it with all of Europe. And generally with Italy, we're thinking more of like wine than we are of these hard alcohols and things. But it actually is higher in all other or most other European countries. So to say, well, they don't have a drinking problem, why can't we just make it 18 here and it will be so much better for our kids? It's actually not the truth. So decades of research has consistently shown that children who are permitted to drink in the home, even in small amounts, do this outside of the home. They drink more often, and they have more problems. So parents, again, who think, well, if I just can teach them in the home how to drink, they're going to be fine. They're not going to want to do it outside of the home. It's not the case. They're not just drinking in your home and then when they go to a party saying, oh no, I did that at home, I'm fine, I'm not going to have it. You can't teach your children how to drink responsibly. And one of the best ways to think about this is, you know, alcohol is a drug. And would we take any other drug and teach our kids how to use it responsibly? Would we give our kids just a little bit of cocaine so that when they go to a college party, they know how to use cocaine? No, we would never even think of that. So why do we think of alcohol so differently? So now after hearing all this information and feeling like you need to say something to your kids, you need to start talking, what can you do? Well, the really important thing that I want you to take away from tonight, again, we talked about before having the power to make a difference. 3 out of 4 teens say that their parents are the leading influence on their decisions about alcohol. You may feel like your teen's friends are, but it's actually you. 75% of kids are saying it's you. So what you say makes a difference for the positive or the negative. If you're lax about it and you say it's really not that big of a deal or there's really not consequences when it happens, your kids are picking up on that. So know that what you say is going to make a difference and feel empowered tonight to be able to make those changes. After tonight's program, you'll be receiving some links tomorrow. One of those links will be to our handbooks. So really what we'd like to do tonight is just give you some of the basic information of why it's important to talk to your kids and then give you these handbooks. They'll be in an online format to really go through in detail any questions you might have, any concerns, and how to talk to your kids. They're very in-depth and detailed. So, and they will kind of guide you through multiple conversations. This isn't just a one-time conversation with your kids. We're going to talk a little bit about what's in the handbooks quickly, but again, it's kind of your job after today to go through them at your own pace when you have time and use them as a guide as you continue those conversations with your children, not just today, but down the road as well. And again, they come in the form of middle school handbooks, high school, and then we also have them in English and Spanish. So depending on where your children are, you may want to focus on the middle school or the high school. There's not a huge difference in the two, but just a little bit more about kind of age appropriateness and just kind of what their worlds are like at those ages. Okay, so one of the topics in the middle school and high school book really talks about teens thinking in the here and now. So remember, it's really hard for them to think about those long-term consequences and what life is going to be like for them when they're 20 years old. So just keeping that in mind as you are talking to them. It talks about their desire for freedom and independence, and how they start to encounter kind of new moral dilemmas about risky behaviors, alcohol, marijuana, and other drugs. So this is really when they start to kind of think about all these things and when those peer pressures start. And again, the topics will be in much more detail when you read the books. Something else that's really important to think about, and there's a little scan, you can actually scan the QR code on your screen now, or you can do it from the book as well. But this talks about your parenting style. And if you scan the QR code, you can actually take a quick test to see what kind of parent you are. The 4 main types are authoritarian, overprotective, permissive, and positive or authoritative. So sometimes it's a little confusing between authoritarian and authoritative. But the research has shown, and we're not here to kind of say which type is the best, or if you're one over the other, that it's not going to be good. But when it comes to talking to your kids about drugs and alcohol, the research has shown that positive authoritative parents have been found to have the best results with their kids when talking to them, that those children tend to drink less and tend to make better choices when it comes to drugs and alcohol. As compared to authoritarian parents, those children tend to drink the most and be the most rebellious. So you can take that little quiz and learn a little bit more about who you are as a parent. And if you find that maybe you aren't a positive authoritative parent and you want to be, learning a little bit about kind of what that looks like and what types of discussions you can have with your kids. So another topic in the book is just talking about alcohol in general, ways to have those conversations, how to talk about your family values and consequences when children do break the rules, and also about handling questions about your own history with underage drinking. That's probably going to come up as a question. Your kids are probably going to ask you, did you drink underage? And there's some tips in there on how to handle those questions and, be able to focus it on the conversation now. So starting that conversation, really, it's as simple as just talking to your children. If your children can be difficult to talk to sometimes, you want to really get in the habit of asking permission to talk and ask questions. Just think about, kids are like any of us, right? They have bad days too, probably more so than we do, because sometimes emotionally they're not as able to handle some things, right? So if they just had a really bad day at school and all of a sudden you're like, I went to this class last night about underage drinking and we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about this right now, they're probably not going to be pretty open to that. So getting in the habit of just saying, hey, is this a good time? Or do you have a lot going on? Can we talk now? Or is it better to talk at another time? You're going to get a lot better of a conversation. And just talking about anything and everything. Talk a lot, talk often. Talk about their friends, ask questions, get to know what's going on in their life, talk about the things that they like, the shows that they're watching, whatever it might be. Just having that conversation all the time is going to make those harder conversations easier down the road, because it's not going to be like the only time you talk to your kids is when you want to talk to them about some kind of danger or something bad that's going on. So they're going to be more receptive to having those conversations with you. I like to suggest doing those car talks. Especially if you have one of those teens that just doesn't really want to look you in the eye and have that, kind of sit down on the couch conversation. The car is a great place to talk because they're kind of stuck there, right? And they're listening, even though they might be acting like they're not. They're probably looking out the window and they probably are acting like they're not paying attention, but they're taking that information in. And it may be easier for them to take it in that kind of setting than this kind of serious, let's sit down and have a talk setting. It's also important to seek discussion and not lecture. So if you just, again, like I said, if you come in, saw this conversation last night about underage drinking and we have to talk right now, they're probably not going to be as receptive as having a discussion, asking some questions, what's going on? Have you had, are your friends drinking? Have you had those kind of peer pressure moments already? How have you handled those kinds of things? And then letting your thoughts be known and letting the consequences be known. So it's not just about asking kids questions and not letting them know where you stand. You want to let them know where you stand as well, but seeking that discussion rather than just kind of laying down what the rules are and not, having a conversation with them. So another topic in the book will be about helping your teens make good choices as a whole. So tips for dealing with peer pressure, finding alternatives to drinking and alternative activities that they can do. Guiding them on how to choose their friends, setting expectations and rules, and also information on there about getting help when your teenager has a drinking problem already, because some parents may be here tonight saying, okay, we're beyond this point. We're not about the beginning to talk to our kids about alcohol. We're at the point where I feel like my child has a problem. That doesn't mean that this information is not applicable to you or that you can't use these handbooks and still have those conversations. So we want you to feel like you can still use it and there's additional resources for you for that as well. So something that we've added to the handbooks recently is a little bit more on marijuana, especially here in Connecticut, it being legal. We do want to focus on it a little bit more. And one of the important things that we found, MADD did a study about almost 2 years ago now, it was during COVID, about perceptions of marijuana and alcohol when it came to driving. So they asked parents and grandparents how frequently they had conversations with their teens about alcohol and driving and marijuana and driving. As you could tell, for alcohol, the often and sometimes category was over 56%. So they were talking to their kids a lot. But when it came to marijuana, that number was under 40%. So there's a big difference between how much they're talking about alcohol and how much they're talking about marijuana. So we want to remind you that it's important to have those conversations with your teens, especially now that it's legal. Sometimes when something's legal, teens tend to think that it's safe. And even adults tend to think that there might not be as many rules around it. It's still just like alcohol, where you can't drink and drive, you can't use marijuana and drive. So reminding teens of those things is really helpful too, that just because something's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's safe and doesn't mean that there aren't any rules regarding it. It's still always going to be illegal for those under 21. And it's always going to be illegal even for adults to use it and drive. So one of the important things when you are talking about marijuana with your teens, and this may be something that you yourself might have to do a little bit of research on. I find that it's hard when we're talking to parents and grandparents about marijuana because they have their perception of what marijuana was like when they were young. If they used marijuana, they feel like they know what marijuana is these days. And it's really different. It's really different than it even was 10 to 15 years ago. So if you're thinking about your experience with marijuana, you may be thinking, well, it's not that bad. And you know what? I'd rather my kids do this than alcohol because they can't even become addicted. And that's really not true. It might have been true of that marijuana of the 70s and 80s, but it's not true of today's marijuana. The THC, which is the addictive component and also the part that gives you the high, has risen to levels of 30% now in some cases, where it was about 1% back in the 70s. So that addictive piece is so much higher. and the part that's giving you the high is so much larger. So it's really not even the same drug. We're not even comparing the same drug that we were talking about back then. So you may need to educate yourself a little bit first on what marijuana looks like today before you have those conversations with your kids, or you may need to talk to your significant other or other people in your life who may be kind of having those, maybe saying those things, especially now as kind of talk is becoming more common about marijuana. They may just be saying things like, it's not that harmful for you, you know, it's okay to drive on it, things like that, because they're thinking about their experience of the past. Okay, so I want to just wrap up our educational part of the program. We're going to have our Q&A afterwards with a presentation dedication. All of our MADD presentations have a victim story attached to them, and it's usually a victim either of drunk driving or underage drinking. And this really hits home why we do the work that we do. So I'm going to share the story of Olivia. I'm going to read the story as told by her mother. My daughter Olivia didn't wake up one day desiring to be an alcoholic and an addict and lose her life at 21. That came about from the friends and choices that she made. Olivia took her first drink around age 13. Looking back, there were signs. Her friends changed in middle school, and her diaries talked about how badly she wanted to fit in. I once dropped her off at a house of a friend, and when I returned, she was so intoxicated with alcohol poisoning that we went straight to the emergency room. Drinking caused Olivia to lose her virginity just before the 8th grade to a high school senior. Then she was so ashamed, she drank more and tried to take her own life. Counseling helped for a while, but if she took one drink, she just couldn't stop. Olivia was a repeat offender. She got arrested, did drugs, wrecked a car, and became involved in an abusive relationship. Despite all the bad things, she still graduated early from high school with wonderful grades. When she wasn't under the influence, she was sweet and charming and funny. At 21, Olivia called and asked for help. We got her waitlisted for an inpatient treatment program. She was supposed to call daily to check in for an opening, but Olivia stopped calling, thinking she could handle it on her own. 3 months later, she drove drunk, hit an embankment, and died the next day. Later, I learned that one of Olivia's closest middle school friends allowed kids to drink in the home as long as no one was driving. I had no idea. I trusted other parents and put my head in the sand. I never wanted to believe that my daughter had a drinking problem or was less than perfect. Losing Olivia changed our family forever. The simplest things you take for granted become a monumental event, like setting the kitchen table, just holding that extra plate in your hand. I share her story because if one person chooses not to go down the same path, then Olivia's life and death have purpose, and that gives me comfort. And that's really why we do what we do, so that we don't have to share stories like this anymore. And I think in Olivia's story, you can see a lot how, while alcohol was the main problem, it also caused so many other problems, that other problems kind of spiraled out of control from the alcohol. So it's important to remember too that this isn't just one of those things where your kids are just, they can drink on the weekends and it's not going to cause any other problems in their life. It can certainly lead to kind of a spiraling of other events as well. So I'm going to just finish up with reminding you that, like we've been saying, you do have the power to make a difference. Your teens are listening to what you say. So what are you saying to them? And I'm going to unshare my screen now, and then we will open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, Nicole. That was great. You covered like every important thing that I feel like we all, when we become parents, that we all
Aren't really aware of early enough. And then at some point we start to kind of try to put together the issues and the messages that are out there. And that was just so important. And I wanted to add a comment, something you were saying about marijuana. It'll come back to me. But I guess first, let me just say, Carrie put in the chat or in the message, if you have a question at this point, you can put it in the Q&A. You can't use the chat function on this Zoom, but you can put it in the Q&A and Nicole and I can see it and respond. Or you can go ahead and unmute yourself, I think, and just ask us if you have a question. So we'll pause for that for a minute, and otherwise I'll share some data that we have from Westport, and we'll just continue the conversation that way. Oh, actually, you cannot unmute yourself. Sorry. So you have to put your question in the Q&A. We'll give it a second. Okay, I don't see any comments at the moment. So go ahead and throw them in the chat if you have any, in the Q&A if you have any questions. But in the meantime, I'm just going to show some data that we have from Westport, because we're so lucky to have the Westport Library, making this available for us. Thank you for attending tonight, but we're also recording this. The library is recording it, and it'll be available to anyone after the fact. So I just think it's really important for people to sort of know what's happening with our students here in Westport. This is a survey we conducted last year in April through a collaboration with Westport Public Schools. This was funded through the grant money that we have at the Westport Prevention Coalition. And what you can see here is we asked middle school through high school students about their current use of different substances. And the national measure is whether or not they've been using that substance in the past 30 days. So alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, misuse of prescription drugs, meaning, borrowing someone's ADHD med to study for a test, or taking more of something that you were prescribed than you were prescribed, and vaping. And what you can see here is alcohol is far and away the most used substance among our students in Westport. But again, the vast majority aren't using it. The only time it becomes a majority of students who are drinking is senior year, when we had 60% drinking. It is a high rate compared to other towns. So I don't love it, but I do want to reemphasize that the majority of kids aren't doing this. In middle school, rates are low. The vaping is the green line and marijuana is the orange line. So as you can see, these are things that aren't happening much until high school. They start at low rates and they grow more slowly, which means at any point that parents, teachers, caring adults help kids get a message that, wait till your brain is developed before you engage in these risky substances. That's why they're illegal until you're 21. Your brain is still developing until 25. The earlier people get those messages, with every year that they delay starting a substance, their outcomes are better. And important reasons, just more data that's local to back up the same messages that Nicole had. If people know that substance use is risky, if they know about the impact on their brain, they're less likely to use any substance. And so here's what our Westport Public School youth told us last year in April. They were asked, whether they thought using tobacco, prescription drugs, et cetera, was risky. And so here's alcohol, which we're focusing on tonight. And what you see here is 78% of middle and high school students thought that drinking 5 or more drinks at a time, 1 or 2 times a week, so that's binge drinking a couple times a week, 78% of them thought that was risky. It's actually highly risky, as we heard in the story, not just the data that Nicole shared, but the anecdote, right? So binge drinking is associated with things like risky sexual behavior, right? It's not just the deaths, it's also unprotected sex, unsafe decisions of all sorts. And so I would say that we really want this number of 78 to be closer to 100% of kids realizing that binge drinking a couple times a week is dangerous. And I also just want to highlight that there is much lower perception that cannabis, meaning marijuana, is harmful. Students thought that using it a couple times a week as a teen, 58% of students thought that that was dangerous. Actually, at that age, kids who use marijuana a couple times a week have a very significantly increased risk of addiction, psychosis. They can lose 6 to 8 IQ points. It's very dangerous for the teen brain. So again, this number should be closer to 100%. And that's where adults play a part in teaching about the risks and talking about the risks. And then this is just to show when kids recognize the risks of something, they do it less. So this is all Westport teens, middle and high schoolers, 25% of them were drinking last year, but only 23% of those who thought it was harmful. But 35% of students who didn't think alcohol was harmful were drinking. So basically, they drink more if they don't recognize the risks. Same pattern everywhere with cannabis. Again, that's marijuana, double the percentage. So if kids don't realize how dangerous it is, they're much more likely to use it. And the final message, because this is a presentation aimed at parents, is just to highlight how important your conversations with your kids are. This data is again showing 25% of Westport middle and high school students were using alcohol last year, 10% were using marijuana, cannabis. But now what these other bars are showing is what is the percent of kids who were using alcohol or cannabis who, disaggregated based on whether they think their friends, their peer group is doing it or not doing it and what they think their parents think about it. So just look at alcohol. 25% of all kids were drinking, but I want to make sure it's the bright blue color. Youth who believe their parents don't disapprove, right? Because parents aren't like, I approve of you drinking, but they might be not talking about it, right? And some parents are saying, oh, you can share my beer, you can have a little bit of wine at this event, whatever. But so double the rate, 25% versus 52% of kids drinking if they think their parents don't disapprove. And with cannabis, it's even a much larger increase, 10% of kids using marijuana, 38% of the kids, let's say the kids whose parents aren't talking to them about marijuana, 38% of them are using it. And again, all those negative impacts on the developing brain. So I just wanted to share that data briefly and see if there are any questions or comments about any of that. And I see that Kevin's gotten here. Kevin, again, is my co-chair. He's the Westport Youth Services Director, co-chair with me of the Westport Prevention Coalition. So Kevin, thanks for joining us tonight. I know you had something else going on. Nicole did a great presentation, and I was just sharing some of our data from our youth survey last year.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, sorry to be jumping in late. I know it's, it's great information, and hopefully we can spark some of those conversations or at least help build that toolkit for parents to have more of these conversations and build off of that discussion that we talked about with the Don't Wait presentation, certainly in March.
Yeah, exactly. Tomorrow, Nicole's going to send out, or maybe the library will send out the wonderful flip books that Nicole was showing, which have incredible information in them. And you guys update those all the time, Nicole, right? So those are great resources. Want to pause again and just take a beat and see if there are any comments or questions from anybody here in the presentation.
Margaret will also include a link to our teen booklet as well. So if parents, along with having those conversations, also want a physical resource to give to their teens, because the handbook wouldn't be appropriate for them to actually give to the teens. It's more for just the parents. We'll have those teen booklets as well linked.
That's great. I don't think I've even seen that, so that's really great.
Yeah, it just went virtual recently. It's always just been a hard copy.
Oh, cool.
Okay. Can we go back to something you said at the very beginning, Nicole, because I want Kevin to hear it, but you were mentioning new legislation that MADD has, that has gone through, that's confirmed that all new cars will be sensing. Why don't you tell us exactly what it is?
Yep. So it had to pass through both the House and the Senate. So it was two different bills, the HALT Act and the RIDE Act. And pretty much when it passed, it essentially will put technology in cars. I think the year right now, I think they're looking at is 2026, but I don't know exactly if that's what's going to stay. But all new cars will have to have that technology in them to detect at least drunk driving, but depending on what technology they pick, they still haven't picked which technology it's going to be. It may be impairment as a whole. So it might even detect if somebody is under the use of drugs, or even if just someone's overly tired. A lot of this technology actually already exists in cars. A lot of higher end cars, you can get those safety features added in. A lot of companies tend to turn those features off if you don't want them or they don't promote them. And because now this is going to be standard across the board, it's not like people can pick and choose and say, well, I don't want that technology in my car because I'm a drunk driver, where they could potentially say that now they might not choose to get that safety feature, but this will be across standard in all cars. So it will take a lot of time for that to filter through because we're talking about new cars. And if you think now there's cars from the 80s still on the road, but every year it's going to decrease it, dramatically. And then when we get even 10 years out from now or 20 years out from now, we'll see a huge decrease. So in our children's lives, they won't have to be talking about drunk driving or maybe even impaired driving as a whole.
That's amazing. Well, the other type of impaired driving is the distracted driving with our cell phones, and that's the other issue.
Yeah, and
we
so that's,
have to
we're hoping that that's the
Yeah.
technology that they pick is the impaired driving as a whole. It will work a lot more with like your eyes and just kind of how it will kind of guide that as opposed to just like a breathalyzer
you're
type
looking
system in the
at.
car, but we just don't know exactly yet which one's going to be picked.
That's great. That is really great. I was just
Yeah, that's-
reflecting mentally though when you were going through. Oh, sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, that's great news. And yeah, the first thing that came to mind was the distracted driving through texting and driving. So, any advancements you can make on that front just to make the roads safer. Certainly, it's well worth it. That's terrific. So it'll be exciting to see that roll out.
And especially, because while drunk driving has decreased since we started our mission back 40 years ago, sadly, since COVID, we've seen an increase in fatal crashes, especially here in Connecticut, related to alcohol and unrelated to alcohol. So just fatal crashes in general, while there's been less people on the road, the drunk driving fatal crashes have increased and just the fatal crashes in general. So that's obviously not good news. We don't want to see those numbers going up. So now it's more important than ever that we have safety features in cars so that we don't see those numbers continue to rise.
It's how prevention works, right? Like having some environmental strategies and not having everything depend on the individual's behaviors or choices at a given moment. Like you want both to be in sync, but because I was thinking when you were talking how I've been in a couple of schools recently talking with kids about alcohol and marijuana in high schools. And when you talk to them about marijuana and driving under the influence, they all come back at me with like, I mean, literally, I've had this conversation with so many kids and they come back at me with like, okay, so it's still better to drive under the influence of weed than alcohol, right? And I'm like, so this is a false dichotomy. You don't have to, you should not be thinking that you're choosing between driving drunk or under the influence of weed. You should be thinking there's a way I'm not driving or getting in a car, which is with any driver impaired. And there's driving with a like straight, sober, clean driver. But it just shows like that teen brain, right? The teen brain takes risks, like the judgment center is still developing. And if we're just trying to send messages to kids like, don't drive this way, then they're like, well, then I can drive this way. And so it just comes back to the general message here, which is talking to our kids about all this stuff, talking regularly, giving them options, making sure they have an exit strategy. So don't get in a car with an impaired driver. Like text me, call me at 3 a.m. for a ride, whatever it is, I'll get you home. And if they can implement these safety features in cars, then even better, because if the car like locks up and you can't drive in it, even better.
And Margaret, just one more piece too that we didn't touch upon tonight, but we do in our teen programs when you talked about don't get in the car with an impaired driver. We've heard stories of teens who haven't been impaired themselves, but have gotten in the car because they thought that they could help from the passenger seat. They didn't drive themselves. Maybe they didn't know how to drive that kind of car, or they were too young or whatever, but they thought that being in the passenger seat, they could guide the person in some way. And unfortunately, for a lot of the teen stories that we've heard, they have been the ones that have been killed in those crashes. So you're never going to be able to do something from the passenger seat. The best thing is to always try to get a safe ride home for both of you. But if that person is already off in the car and just waiting for you to get in, do not get in the car with them. You're not going to be able to do anything from the passenger seat.
Well, I'm just looking at the Q&A here to see if anybody has any questions. I'm not seeing any. So we'll give it another 30 seconds. And if there's nothing else, I want to really thank the library for hosting this tonight and making the recording available. I think we'll be able to, the recording will be available probably through the Westport Prevention Coalition, which is on westporttogether.org. as well as through the Westport Library websites. And I especially want to thank Nicole for her great presentation and Mothers Against Drunk Driving for all the research, all the lobbying advocacy you do, the research, updating the slideshow every year. Because I noticed how different the presentation was from the last time I've seen it. And it's always just better and better. It's just terrific.
Thank you. And there's a
so
new
it's
one coming.
That's great. I mean, it's a grim topic, but it's so important, right? And we're all parents here, I think. So, you know, that you can't have this conversation enough. It's so important. So
Thank you for having
very
me.
much. Yeah. All right. Well, be safe, everyone. Good night.